Okay.
In less than a minute, ma'am.
In less than a minute. And Ananjit is also here.
Ananjit, sir, are you here?
Yes, he's here.
Okay, not able to
Ananjit,
can't see him, ma'am.
He's here,
Okay.
but his audio is on mute. I can see. There.
Umesh, sir, we can begin.
Please go ahead.
I am here.
Oh, all right. Good evening and welcome to the third episode of the Colors of Life webinar series being done by the Faculty of Behavioral and Social Sciences and Liberal Arts and the Dr. O.P. Balla Foundation. Today, we are very privileged to have with us Dr. Nityananda, who will be in conversation with Dr. Chavi Bhargav Sharma on a post-COVID world of economic recovery. Ma'am, over to you.
Right. Good evening, and on behalf of Faculty of Behavioral and Social Sciences and Manav Rachna International Institute of Research and Studies, it is an honor to welcome Professor Nityananda, and we thank you for agreeing to be part of the series Colors of Life, where we will be holding conversations and listening to people who have traveled unique paths, chosen careers in liberal arts, and redefined traditional education. And this we are hosting in conjunction in association with Dr. O.P. Balla Foundation. And Dr. O.P. Balla Foundation is the organization for community service and philanthropy, and we are part of that. And before I begin, a little introduction about Professor Nityananda. Professor Nityananda is a research professional with more than 2 decades of experience on research, consulting, and teaching. He worked on international trade, industry, investment, healthcare, environment and development issues, the political economy, and the legal aspects of these in particular, with current focus on the interface between environment and social development. His work issues, he has covered issues and challenges in India and South Asia, but often Southeast Asian and African nations as well. He has been involved with more than 40 research consulting projects, and in about half of them as the principal investigator. Currently, he is director at the Council for Social Development, New Delhi, a premier research institute working on issues of social development. Previously, he worked at the National Council of Applied Economic Research, CUTS International, and the Energy and Resources Institute at Perry. During his tenure at Perry, he was also an adjunct faculty at the Terry School of Advanced Studies, a deemed university. He has about 120 research publications, including in peer-reviewed journals and as book chapters and monographs. He has authored 2 books and edited 4 volumes. He has written several articles for various newspapers and magazines as well. Among his books, Expanding Frontiers of Global Trade Rules, The Political Dynamics of the International Trading System, Routledge, London and New York 2008, received wide acclaim. Currently, he is working on a book titled India's Industrial Policy and Performance Growth, Competition and Competitiveness. He received his education at Calcutta University and JNU, New Delhi. And before, a little bit about the concept behind this webinar series. We launched this on Monday, on 3rd of August, and this is the third in the series. And FBSS, Faculty of Behavioral and Social Sciences and Liberal Arts, aims to become the preeminent intellectual and creative school for effective engagement in a life that requires individuals to grapple with complex problems, pursue more fluid and flexible career pathways, and be the harbingers of change, contributing to a better, ethical, and just world. And COVID is just the right time to look at how we can change the future and post-COVID era. Our programs, the programs we are running are BA, BSc Honors in Psychology, Economics, Political Science, Sociology, Liberal Arts. We have MA in Psychology, Public Policy and Public Act, Economics, Social Work, and we have a PhD programs in Psychology, Economics, and Social Work. Some of the USPs that we feel we have been able to, cultivate and our experiential and interactive approach, mandatory community service, state-of-the-art psychology lab, human lab, social action research center, field immersion projects, 360-degree coaching and mentoring, life skills training. Our aim is to make social sciences, humanities, liberal arts, the backbone of education and the backbone of a holistic life. And with this, I invite Professor Nityananda, and I would look at, we are looking, it will be a question and answer session, but we would first like your views. We would like to know your views on the post-COVID economic scenario. But before that, we would also want to know what made you take up economics. A little bit of your story, and then the story of what it is going to be in your words, and how do you see the post-economic, how do you see the society as a whole post-COVID?
Well, thank you for those generous words. Now you have raised an intriguing question, why I chose economics. Now, honestly speaking, it was a very bold decision on my part at that point of time, because in those late 80s, early 90s, people didn't really know what are the job prospect of economics, So, and I come from a very small town where people did not think beyond teaching, and more so in school teaching. And people thought, if you are going for economics, that job is over for you, because, it's typically, you don't need too many economics teachers. So I was suggested that I should either go for English or go for mathematics, because these are the two areas where you have huge demand, where students find difficulty in learning them, and you really have dearth of good teachers. And for whatever reason, some of my teachers said, you are good in both mathematics and English, so you should choose one of them. So I thought, if I am good in both of them, then I should probably not choose one of them. I should choose something that I don't know, or I know very little. And then I kind of tried to explore, what are the subjects? Now, one observation that my teachers gave me, that, English and mathematics, you have reasonably good understanding. So my exploration was, I want to know something new, but where I could possibly use my knowledge of mathematics and English. Then I kind of zeroed down onto economics. And then I also thought that this is a subject where you can actually have a lot of scope and lot of prospects. And also, I was aware of the fact that this is one subject where you also get economics Nobel Prize. Not that I was thinking of getting Nobel Prize, but the fact that, in my understanding, if a subject is given Nobel Prize, that means that subject must be something very, very important, useful for the society. So why not choose this subject, which I do not know much, and my existing knowledge would be helpful in learning the subjects. So that was the kind of motivation I had before choosing economics. And I should say that I never regretted my choice. Though I was off and on from economics per se, I went for social sector, I went for environmental issues, where of course economics knowledge is used, but that is not core economics. But still, I also get into core areas of economics, including industrialization, economic growth, international trade. These are also very hardcore economics areas where I work. And as you read out, currently I am working on a book project on industrialization of India, history of industrialization, especially since 1950s. So when I was asked about what COVID and post-COVID recovery, I thought this is something that I could link how we did well or not so well in industrial policy and performance, and how in the post-COVID world, we can do, we can improve, or we, find difficult to improve. But let me clarify one thing. We are, living in a world of uncertainty, and the kind of and the quantum of uncertainty that we have not seen for almost a century. So other day somebody was asking me that, how countries and companies can deal with such uncertainty. Can we have something like some sort of risk mitigation like insurance or future market, something like that? I thought, if this kind of uncertainty that is not so often and that occurs only in a century, the market will fail. You will not go for insurance premium, insurance policy. You don't expect something to happen in the next few years. So it will not work. Nobody will buy such insurance. And secondly, the uncertainty is so huge that those who would be potential supplier of insurance, they would also be reluctant, because the kind of damage you will have, the kind of loss that the policy holders would have, they will find it difficult to put a kind of fixed premium for those kind of loss, or whether that kind of loss can be covered by any kind of policy. So typically you will have market failure. Now we are talking about post-COVID world recovery, but we are not yet in the post-COVID world. We are still in the COVID world. That's true for the world as a whole. That's true for India, of course. In some countries, of course, they have contained to a large extent spread of COVID. Though you are seeing second waves coming somewhere, but those are still not very, widespread. So we are still in COVID world. We are not yet in post-COVID world. Now, longer we remain in COVID world, more difficulty we will have in the post-COVID world for recovery. And the fact that in India we have not yet been able to, contain that in a very remarkable way, it's going to be a very negative on our part, because people who matter, the decision makers in economics, the economic agents, they are still in uncertainty. You want more production to come, you want more investment to take place, but who will put their money when we are still in uncertainty? So this is going to make our situation more difficult. So, and we have not really done too well in terms of management of COVID or spread of COVID so far. Of course, one reason for that is, of course, we do not have good health care system. I mean system, when I mean saying system, it is not about the hospitals, but a system where, people can very easily get in touch with the healthcare facilities, right? So meaning that it need not be very well equipped tertiary healthcare facilities, but you must have a point of reference very close to your home where you can easily access. I mean primary healthcare. That is the more important part. Uh, Secondly is that we have seen over the last 2 to 3 decades, lot of private healthcare facilities have come up, and they are of course not in primary healthcare, but mostly in tertiary care. Even those healthcare facilities are not sufficient, and they're not coming up so boldly to take care of people. Now here again, typically market might not work because, it's a question of demand and supply. Now, when you leave it to private sector will create facilities keeping normal demand in mind, not exceptionally high demand that you will find in such times. So obviously, when your supply of healthcare is based on demand coming, private care would not think about abnormal demand because they will not keep very, very high excess capacity. So even if they, all those private facilities are pressed into operation, they would still be insufficient. So that's why, not taking care of primary health care and not taking care of public health facilities is, putting us. And it is not something that we have ignored over the last few years, but we have ignored it over the last 3 decades at least, since we went for so-called economic liberalization in the early 90s. That is one part. Second part is that when it comes to recovery, just few months back in February, in March, people are talking about that big companies, the foreign companies, are thinking about leaving China and going to other countries like India, Vietnam, and such countries. Now, is anybody talking about that anymore? No, because now people kind of respond to a very short-term considerations. And the moment short-term changes, that consideration changes, the decision also changes. Now, those who are thinking about leaving China in February, March, they will not think about leaving China. In fact, some companies are actually coming back to China now. Why? Because for whatever reason, they have managed it very well. Despite being the epicenter of this pandemic, their management of this pandemic has been reasonably better. Better from many countries in Europe, and of course better than India and many other countries. Now, when I look at which countries have done better, which countries have not done better, it's a very tricky question to look at because if you look at the number of COVID cases, no country gives you the actual number, and the actual number is in all countries much higher than the numbers you are finding. Because actual number is dependent on how many tests you have done. And if you have not done too many tests, you will not get even close to the actual numbers. So looking at actual number of cases is futile. On the other hand, if you look at the number of deaths, even that is not 100% reliable, but that would be more reliable because death is something that has been seen and those are recorded more. And in most cases, death are being looked at whether the death has occurred due to COVID or not. So COVID deaths is a much more better indicator to know which countries have done better. Now, if we look at that, something very, very strange comes up. A country like Belgium is the worst performer. If you look at the number of deaths per million population, it has the highest number of deaths, more than 800 per million. On the other hand, Indian death is much low. It's as of 2 days back, it was only about 28 per million. So you can imagine Belgium 849 and India just 28. But don't start singing and dancing that we have done so well. We have done so better than Belgium, which 849, USA where it is almost 500, Canada is 237, UK 680. So they are far higher compared to our death figure. But the moment you turn your eyes to other countries, China, only 3 per million population. So our 28, China's only 3. If you look at countries like Mongolia and Cambodia, imagine 0 deaths, no death from COVID. In a poor country like Cambodia, in a poor country like Mongolia. 0.1 per million death in a poor country like Myanmar. 0.06 death per million in a country like Vietnam, where per capita income is far lower than us, right? So it's very difficult to say why it is happening, but if you look at the way it is happening, you can see that, Asian countries, the African countries, in African countries like, Ethiopia, you have only 3 deaths per million. Nigeria, you have only 4 deaths per million. So these countries are very low death figure. So some people say, is it because something like some genetic issues are there? That some countries are genetically different from European countries, and because of this, this may be lower. There are also other figures like, your pre-COVID exposure to infection is very low, so you are more susceptible to new infection. Then other factors like, BCG vaccination, and also the age structure of population. These all have come, but there is no definitive answer. But of course, one cannot say that these countries have done far better only because of they have the government and the policymakers handle it better. But some countries, of course, have better health facilities, those who have handled it better. Now, this is one part. Now, second thing is that who will have an advantage in post-COVID economic recovery? Now, countries that have very highly competitive industrial sector as of now, they will have an advantage provided they have handled COVID very well. Now, the moment that comes, the country that comes to my mind is China, because it has done in terms of management of COVID pretty well, and it has also become industrially very competitive. It has captured the whole world industrially. The whole world's markets are flooded with Chinese goods. You have heard now concern in India about why so much Chinese goods. The concerns are genuine. This is not a happy occasion, happy situation that you don't produce much in the country, or you depend almost on everything on Chinese. Can I share the screen? Can you see the screen somehow?
Yes, sir.
You can see the screen?
Yes, sir. Yes,
Yes,
sir.
we can see the screen.
Yeah. In the screen, you can see that, I've shown from 1980s to current time. And you will see that, how China has progressed in terms of, this is the line. China was not much ahead of India, even in the year 2000. It was slightly higher than India. But now look where it has come. And it is now producing almost 40%, actually more than 40% of global industrial production. That's how China is controlling. And US at some point of time was controlling you know, some 35% of global production, and they have come down to about 20% now. So that's where China has come, and India could not move far. Now, to give you some other ideas which you might be shocked to know, in 1990, you know, if you look at Chinese GDP and if you look at India's GDP, in 1987, India's GDP was higher than China. Can you imagine? In 1987, India's GDP was higher than China's. Not too much, slightly higher than China. And now, after 1991, how it has changed. India's GDP has grown up, of course, but Chinese GDP has gone up much, much higher level. And today, Chinese GDP is almost 5 times higher than India's. Now come to per capita income. Indian per capita income was higher than China's even in 1990. Can you imagine? Nobody will believe it, but this is the reality. And from 1991 is the year when China surpassed India's per capita income. And that is the year we initiated you know, economic reforms, whatever way. But then in India, people say it has got tremendous success, but how do you measure success? You know, from 1960 to 1990, India was moving along with China in GDP, in per capita income, almost both, you know, at the similar speed. And suddenly, after 1991, China started growing at a very, very fast rate, and we started growing almost at the same rate, you know. This is how, you know, so essentially, China opened its economy in 1978. They started growing. In fact, their growth rate did not jump up immediately after opening. So even if they are opened, we are relatively probably closed. We're actually not closed, but this is the perception. You know, Chinese economy is even now more closed than our economy was in 91. But whatever way, they initiated some reforms and they did not see much success till early 1990s or late 1980s. And this is how Indian economic growth occurred. Now, I will show you something very interesting. Now, Indian growth rate actually were pretty high in 1950, 1964, 65 for those 15 years. But something went wrong. And during the year, for 1.5 decades, mid 60s to 1980, we did not do well, you know, so our growth rates fell down. You know, all sectors of agriculture, of industry, of services, in all sectors, our growth rate became very low. And again in 1980s, we started growing. And then of course, 1991 and those things are, but I'm focusing on more. Now, what happened in 1960s and in 1970s that our economic growth was so low? Now, economists had this bad habit of claiming that they know everything, you know. Because of that, they don't even look at factors that are not economic. Now, can you say that, you know, in those years, our economy did badly only because we followed a wrong policy? How can you ignore the fact that in 1 decade, we had 3 full-fledged wars? 1962 China War, 1965 Pakistan War, and again 1971 Bangladesh-Pakistan War, you know. So we fought 3 massive wars. And because of that, one thing happened. We before 62, we hardly imported arms from outside. And after that, we started importing arms in huge quantity, So that took a toll on our economic growth. So the money that we were spending for building factories, we started spending that money on buying arms from outside. And you think this will not affect your economic performance. Second thing is that if you look at other things, we had unfortunately very bad years in 60s in terms of drought. And our economy was made up of agriculture. More than 50% of our GDP used to come from agriculture. So in those times, if your agriculture is not doing well, your GDP will come down drastically. But now your agriculture is less than 20%. So even if you have drought, your GDP will not be affected that much. Your GDP is affected by service sector. Your GDP is affected by industry sector, which has higher share of GDP. Third thing is that we had massive oil shocks during this time. And who doesn't know that India depends on oil from outside? Till 1993, China did not import even a drop of oil. They were self-sufficient. And we have been importing oil almost 3/4, and now it is even less, less than 20% we are producing domestically. So more than 80% oil you are importing. And when that oil price jumps up, your economy jumps down. So all these were factors. And we say because of some flawed policies, we did not do well. We did not look at beyond your economic policy regime. So because of that, what happened that when China went for, earlier they had very government dominated economy. They had fully centrally planned economy. They said we'll still keep planning, but we'll go for mixed economy. And we thought mixed economy is a bad idea. Everything should be done in the private sector. The casualty of that was infrastructure. In 1991, we decided not to spend a single rupee on infrastructure. So we stopped, investing on roads, railways, power plants. And, private sector did not respond so quickly. And even if some private sector responded, it was too little too late. When you realize that, our economy is doing so poorly because of poor infrastructure, it is too late. We started new century with huge power sector deficit. We started new century with very poor roads. Our railways tracks were choked, So when you decided now the state has to invest again, we decided for, dedicated freight corridors. We decided for golden corridor of roads. All those we decided, we came back to state. We decided that NTPC has to go initially, and then of course private sector also came. But 10, 15 years we lost in the process. And when we lost these years, China was not sitting. It got an advantage. It went ahead. And we, fell behind in the race. And we are still running behind. And then we opened up our economy without understanding that competing with China is not going to be easy because of the kind of policy China follows, the kind of infrastructure policy it follows, the kind of energy pricing policy it follows, the kind of finance banking policy it follows, that makes it difficult for any country to compete with China because interest rates are very lower in China. Energy price is much lower in China. People are more educated there. You have state-of-the-art infrastructure there. So given that, competing with products from China is not going to be easy. So we should not have dismantled our ecosystem for level playing field that we already had. But we dismantled that. And now China has taken advantage. Now we are, of course, not sure how to do, but of course, The positive point is that now there is recognition that the Indian industry has to stand its own feet. In 1950s, we talked about self-reliance, and in 90s, 20s, after 70 years, we're talking about Atmanirbhar. So we're back to 1950s in a sense. So how we thought about self-reliance in 1950s, probably we have to learn from that lessons, but also we have to learn from your competitor, China, in a sense, how they got where they are today. Now we have to learn from there to beat them, to compete with them. And there, if you see, that state sector is even now very, very important. Because Chinese economy is even now is led by their state-owned companies. There are some 102 public sector undertakings in Fortune 500 list, and about 100 PSCs all over the world. And out of that 102, 75 were from China. So if you look at the global government and companies, it's all about Chinese companies. Now, out of 500, 115 companies in the Fortune list were from China. And so 75 were from governments and 40 were from private companies from China. And compare that with India, we have only just 7 companies in Fortune 500 list in 2017. And 4 of that were from government sector and 3 of them were from private sector. Even in India, we still have government sector more in the Fortune 500 companies, but numbers are far, far, far less compared to China. Now, could this not be the also reason that we fell behind China? They have 105, 115 companies, and we have only 7 companies. And the name will also be very interesting and intriguing. The government companies are usual suspect: Indian Oil, State Bank of India, Bharat Petroleum, and Hindustan Petroleum. So except SBI Bank, all are from petroleum sector. But private sector, Reliance Industries you would expect. Second name is Tata Motors you would expect. And the third name is Rajesh Exports. This is something that probably nobody have heard about. Which company is this? Now, this company is not known so much. This company is not known by brand. This company doesn't do much of business inside India. But this is a big exporter of gems and jewelry from India. So one traditional industry where India has been very strong, you have one company in Fortune 500 list. That's quite amazing. It is not other big companies that you might have thought about. Now, China still has what can be called coordinated economy, and they try to get ahead in so-called emerging industries. Over the last 10-15 years, you might have seen how China has dominated solar power, solar photovoltaics, solar panels manufacturing industry, which nobody thought of. 15 years back, they did not even have the technology. Their planning commission, which they call NDRC, National Development and Reform Commission, they thought we have to do it. This is the industry of the future. And if we don't get into it, we will be falling behind. So they took initiatives in terms of accessing technology, in terms of making finance available to companies, even though the production of those solar photovoltaics are being led by private sector. But their government played a very important decisive role. They decided that we have to be there. Now we talk about, leaving a Bithuk market. Can you tell me that without government intervention, can India think of any day having aircraft industry? We're now sending satellites, right? And we are among the very few countries who have the capability in satellites making. Can anybody tell me, without government initiative, without government investment, we could ever reach that position? This is true for any industry. Wherever you are talking about new emerging technologies or difficult technologies or technologies that other countries would not like to share with you, without government help, your private companies will be nowhere. This is where Brazil could develop a highly competitive aircraft manufacturing industries. China is in the process. In a few years, you will see that Chinese aircraft will compete Boeing and Airbus. I will not go further because, as you said, that this is about more will be up in the question and answer mode conversation. So essentially, I would like to look at the sources of Chinese competitiveness. Cheaper transportation costs, both direct and indirect, lower cost of production due to lower electricity prices, lower cost of production due to lower bank interest rates, better technology. It did not care about intellectual property rights till it entered the WTO in 2002. Before that, it was all free for everyone in China. Anybody could access any technology without any IPR hassles. So that's how they got huge technological advantage. People are educated there. Some people even say that, the differences in development growth rates can be, explained from differences in education level. Better public health facilities, so people, when they can, even if they get lower wages, if your public healthcare facility is very good, then even with their lower wages, people can maintain good health, people can be happy and they can be productive. And of course, China also has better reserves and access to natural resources. Now, we might not have all of them, but of course, in some of them, we can think of developing on our own, learning from them, and crafting our state policy, government policy, so that in the next 10 years, we can redeem our economic space in the global market. I'll stop here. Thank you. And you can now ask me any question if you like.
It is very interesting, and I would want you to just, there are so many more things, and I think Ananjit and all the others, if you have questions, I would personally want you to at least elaborate a little more on, because besides all these things, how would you think it gives us indirectly what we need to do and where we want to move? But China also has a very different political system, which we are a democracy, and many of our hurdles are also because of the democracy. So how do you think, what are the things in simple terms, if you have to say, we need to do and we need to take advantage of the post-COVID situation? Even in this COVID situation, if you give us some pointers, and this is how we should be doing, taking everything into, taking a 360-degree account of everything that India is.
Okay, it is true that being a non-democratic country gave them some advantage. They could do a lot of things very quickly, because democracy means you have to go for consultation, debate and discussion, and it takes time. But a lot of things we did undo in the last 30 years, which we might not have, we could avoided that, and we could avoided that even within the framework of democracy. Now, as I said, not everything we can do that the way Chinese have done, But certain things, of course, we do. One is that we have to think about leveling playing field, better protection of domestic industries. There is no second thought about it. And it is good that, we at least did not go for RCEP. That could have been a disaster. Chinese goods would have come duty-free to India. And when, whether subsidized or not, these are also a very value-laden questions. What is subsidized, what is not subsidized are very important issues. Just to give an example, our diesel price is almost 30% higher than Chinese. Why? Because we tax our diesel, we tax our petrol very highly. And it is not about central government. Even the state governments think that, this is the cash cow for us. So everybody is taxing diesel and petrol, but that will have a cascading effect. Now, you can impose import duty on some goods, right? And you can collect the revenue, and you can lower your tax on diesel. So your energy price would be cheaper. You will be more competitive on one hand, and you will be better protected from Chinese goods on the other hand, because Chinese products would appear more expensive to us. So if you say that, they are subsidizing it is bad, why are you taxing it so much, your oil? Nobody forced you to tax them so well. Second thing is that if you have not spent money on education, primary education, secondary education, nobody forced you to do it. Now we have a new policy, its debate will be there, and the policy have some good provisions, but still there are many unanswered questions about how that 6% of the GDP will come from where it will come, how that will be spent, with what effects. Those are the issues that we have to deal with. But why, after 70 years of independence, our people are not yet educated? This is something, a criminal negligence that we have done. Third thing is that I talked about our interest rates are very high. Why? We have so high NPAs. Our government often say, give them money, give them loans. I think instead of asking them to give them loans, you ask them to give them loans at lower interest rate. Why interest rates should be so high in India? And here I'll tell you one more interesting thing. There is a concept of interest spread, meaning the difference between the interest that we common people get from the banks. If you deposit your money in banks, you will get hardly 4% now, 3.5%, 4%. But when private companies are going to take loan from those banks, they will say, give me 11%, 12%, So why this 8%, 9% difference? Why this spread is so high? That is because our banking system is inefficient, and part of the inefficiency also involves huge NPAs. Now, if banks are having so much bad loans, bad debts, they will pass on that cost to borrowers and depositors, right? So if we suppress our deposits, people like you and me will not put our money in bank. We'll put the money somewhere else. You will buy ornaments, you will buy land, and then our industry will not get money to invest. China ensured that the deposit rates are higher and the lending rates are lower. One interesting point is that why our companies are so bad, they are so much into willful default. This is because our judiciary is so lax. Today, if banks want to take willful defaulter to task, courts will bail them out. They will get some stay and the case will go for 20 years, and then banks will spend a lot of money on litigation, and those costs will come to the economy. So this is something no government has kind of taken up as a serious matter. Why our cases will go for 20, 30 years? Go to China, look how quickly they've resolved all those cases. Now these cases going for 20, 30 years cost the country hugely. Only the judicial system benefits, lawyers might benefit, but not the economy, not the common people. At a macro level, even the companies don't benefit. So everybody is losing out in the process. So these are something we can do. This doesn't need to be, you don't have to be autocratic for that. You can do those things in democratic framework, right? Okay, I can have more questions if somebody has.
Yeah, we'll just open it up. If anybody has questions, please ask.
Can I ask a question?
think
Yeah, please. Ask.
Okay, thank you so much. So first of all, Professor, it was very nice listening to you, and I have a question, and I think one question you already answered about the China thing, because even I think these political systems are so different that it's very difficult to replicate Chinese policies in India. But now my question here is that should we keep following this Chinese model or American model when it comes to economy, this GDP-based, economy, GDP-based growth? Because if you look at the from historical perspective, like we were following the American model, and then China came in like early 90s, they reformed, and now many people want to follow China model. But don't you think that it is going to lead towards the environmental destruction? And also, it's a high time, especially after COVID-19, that India should find its own model. We should be more environment friendly, and we should be based on our own indigenous, I would say culture or our behavior, not driven by the consumerism and this massive capitalism, all these things. Why not we rediscover something which is very indigenous and which is going to make us much stronger, Atmanirbhar, and going to create lots of jobs, and not dependent on this massive global world, which now many world are running away from. For example, if I'm not sure if you're following the European economists, now they're talking a lot about degrowth. I have spoken to a few scholars there, and especially this lady who gave this idea of donut economy, which is completely based on degrowth model. And then Julia Steinberg, who is from Switzerland, she's also talking a lot about degrowth. Kate Raworth also, they're talking about degrowth. So my question is that now the Western world wants to go back. They have realized that their model of this massive GDP-based growth every year, 6%, 7%, 10%, is leading nowhere. It is just leading towards massive destruction and climate crisis. So my question to you is that, do you have answer for this? And do you think that we should step back and find something which is more meaningful and which is more unique, and without following American model, Chinese model? So thank you very much.
Okay, in a sense, you have answered your question. Let me tell you that finding your own model is important at every possible level, for every country, for every individual. You are a student, I guess. If you want to copy somebody, who has done professionally well, you might not succeed. You have to find your own model for your profession, for your career. Same is true for every country. So it is true that we have to learn from everywhere, including from America, including from China. But why I am giving Chinese example more? Because China is coming as the closest competitor we have today. And China is the country which has seen the growth experience in the most recent period. The problem is that Chinese might not tell you what the model they followed. Every country has a tendency to not to tell you the truth that they have followed. And same is true for America also, US. US never tells you what they followed when they were at our stage of development. So what model we have been following in the American model is the American model of 20th, 21st century. If you have to follow the American model, follow the American model of 19th century. Because we are at a stage where America was in 19th century. And America will not tell you how, what kind of policies they follow in those periods. UK, everybody knows how UK developed, it's without India being colony, UK would be nowhere. So those countries had their own model. And when those people are teaching us model, be very, very suspicious, be very, very careful that they will take you to the wrong model. And same is true for degrowth. Degrowth, I fully endorse your concern about environment, climate change, but degrowth should be the model for China, not China probably to some extent, and degrowth should be the model for US and Europeans. But degrowth would not be the model for India. Why? Many people within India who have enough of food, they go for, weekly fast or monthly fast, right? It is degrowth for them. For many people, people go for daily fast, even today. They don't get 2 meals, full meals a day in India. And you will teach them for weekly fast, monthly fast? No. First ensure food for them, then you talk about degrowth. That is the situation for India. Where is US in terms of income, in terms of their consumption, in terms of their, consumerist behavior? Maybe 5%, 10% of our Indian population is competing with Americans in terms of their consumerism, and they might go for degrowth, but India as a country as a whole must not go for degrowth. We should not even talk about degrowth, but degrowth we should talk about in the global context, because the climate is an issue, because natural resource depletion is an issue, but not India should talk about degrowth. But I'm not saying that follow the India, American model, follow the Chinese model. We have to think about, I agree with you, where through which route we can think about economic growth without following the similar model. We're talking about our energy coming more from, solar, all those we're talking about. And actually we're on many contexts, on many, issues, we are spending money beyond our means, the way we are spending on solar power. Even many rich countries are not spending that much. So I'm not saying that you follow them, but degrowth I would not endorse, but responsible growth, yes.
Nituda, can I interject, Nituda?
Yes. Go on.
So, Chit, you should read Kumarappa's work. The lines that Nituda mentioned, Kumarappa in 1934, along with B.R. Ambedkar, wrote a fascinating piece on when Kumarappa joined Gandhiji's village empowerment movement. Kumarappa was an MIT professor, full-fledged MIT professor. He left MIT and he spoke about the politics of education, the point that Nituda mentioned, and why India has to balance and create its own development, not always also following a fetish for full-fledged degrowth before even securing your villages and the meals for them. So I'm not commenting anything. I'm just saying there's a vast literature already in our country about these debates. So maybe Kumarappa's work will help you. So
yeah,
read some
I would endorse that. As of now, our villages have become a lot more dependent on, foreign goods, foreign products, or products coming from out of the villages. Personally, I don't remember when was the last time I drank Coca-Cola or Pepsi.
Sure.
I don't remember when. It might be 10 years, 15 years, I don't remember. So I'm from a village. So when I go to the villages, people offer me Coke. I said, no, I won't have it. They get surprised, they get shocked. Because now they are drinking it, which is not good for your health. And it also has environmental implication. You can have coconut water, you can have lot many Jaljeera, and so many things you have, which are healthy options and which can be done at a very lower scale without needing very sophisticated or protected technology that foreign companies have. uh, you know, uh, so you can have lot many things. You can have Nimbu Pani. It doesn't need any technology. You can make it at home. You can make it at villages. If you think some processing, some kind of preservation is required, you can do it at a very small scale at village level, and the village economy can be lot more self-sufficient. So that would be one way of kind of reducing your reliance of the village economy, not just on foreign countries, but also on the cities. And then that might also prevent a lot of villagers flocking to cities. And we have seen few months back how people from the cities were going back to the villages in the COVID and the lockdown scenario. Probably we will not have them in cities if we think of those policies. But the problem is that I agree to that context that consumerism and thinking that the way the Americans consume is the way for us to go. That way, I am fully with you. So we have to think
Sure.
about how we consume, what we consume. There we need thinking, but that will not involve degrowth. That will involve growth, but in a very different model.
Great. Thanks a lot, Professor, for your reply. And I just want to make it clear that when I mention degrowth, it doesn't mean that I want to stay poor or I want to see India poor or stuck with poverty. Of course not. I just meant that this GDP-based growth model should be revisited, and I think India has enough intellectual capacity to give much better economic model to the whole world and move towards more sustainable way, so that of course we have to come out of poverty. There is no doubt about that. We have hundreds of millions of people below the poverty, and unfortunately due to corona we are still struggling. So this I want to say, of course, I completely agree with you also. We have to take few things from here and there, no matter it's China or America, and we have to find a balance. So I think that's it. So yeah, thanks. Thank you very much.
Okay, okay.
And Nimaida had a question. He had a question. He had raised his hand.
Yeah, good evening, Nitida.
Good evening. Good to see you.
Yeah. Thanks for your. So I'm just wondering that if I go through your discussion today. So first, you have started with the post-COVID situation and the health systems respond to those things. And the second part was basically the growth model, the comparative picture between Chinese and the Indian economy. So yeah, the latter part has a lot of debatable issues. So my first question is that, insurance is one of the better solution for tackling this situation of the post-COVID era. So I just wanted to know, or if you give certain light, that how in the post-COVID era, the risk pooling and risk sharing, the mechanism that insurance market works. So if every people, because of this kind of health emergency, if everyone is trying to go by the risk-loving things, so how it would work or how it would affect the insurance market. So this is one thing, that how insurance market would be worked in terms of risk pooling and risk sharing, when all the peoples from different classes, they would try to purchase the insurance product. The second issue is that when you are talking about the comparative analysis regarding public sector enterprises, and it is quite common phenomenon that because of the command economy of Chinese, so they have lot of.
I don't know why. And I keep checking if you still have a picture or not. And every time I see.
sorry, I think, do you in the view that we have to go back to the command economic kind of system, rather rely on the market-oriented model?
Okay, good. First question that you talk about insurance, I don't know if I communicated wrongly. I said insurance kind of thing doesn't work in this kind of situation, you know, very unexpected, very high level of uncertainty, something that happens in a century. Like, look, you know, in COVID situation, many people are not even getting a hospital bed. Now, if you don't get a hospital bed, insurance is just a useless paper for you. It doesn't work. And as I said, you know, supply of healthcare facilities, depending on private care, would only be up to the point where demand is normal level. For any abnormal level, excess capacity will never be created by private sector. That's the basic economic principle that, you know, even micro, macro, whatever you say, it will not happen. Okay, coming to command economy, I think there is a lot of mischaracterization of economy that we had or economy that China has. China had a command economy till 1978. It was a command economy. As of now, China doesn't have a command economy. It has a mixed economy, very similar to what we actually had. And if you leave aside that licensing part, we did not have much of command economy. And after 1991, we of course removed licensing for most of the sectors, but one, you know, secret is that how many sectors had licensing before 1991? We started removing those licensing in most sectors in the 80s only. So, two things. One is that licensing is a command economy because I'm saying, you know, don't produce that, you know, those kind of things. But the moment you say no licensing is there, it's not command economy anymore. But even in today's world in India, you have licensing requirements for everything. You can't run a factory without some license. You need license for municipality, you need license for many other things. Service is all license based. So licenses are of different kinds. Now, what licensing we talk about mostly is that we needed licensing for pure production, for capacity. That has been removed. So I'm not saying you bring that back in terms of your command economy. What I'm saying is that giving state support, development finance, ensuring that they get energy at a lower price, they get best possible you know, infrastructure, they get good healthcare facilities, they get education. These are not command economy. And I remember, I don't know how old you were, in 1991, I was in college, so I remember Manmohan Singh said that because we have been spending so much money on these government companies, we have not been able to spend much on health and education, and that is where health education is poor. So we'll go for disinvestment, we will not go for further investment, and we'll spend that money on health and education. What happened to that promise? Why after 29 years, our health and education is still in such a poor shape? That means we did not keep the promise. So where the money gone? What happened to our taxation? What happened to our revenue? These are the questions that people should ask. If we could, you know, our savings rate in 1950 was less than 10%. You know, so when your savings rate is very low, you cannot invest much, right? With that investment, very small, with 10% of investment of GDP, we could manage 4%, 5% GDP. And when our savings rate went up to 35%, Why we are making only 7 and 8%? And why we did not go for, universal price? We have a law that called RTE, Right to Education Act, but have we implemented it properly? Have we ensured that everybody gets education? These are not about command economy. These are not about undemocratic economy. These are about democratic demands.
So the thing is that, Nithuda, if every social sector investment and particularly the basic social sector, there is always high demand for allocation. So it is quite expected for the development theory that if the government spend on the development sector, then it has a far-reaching effect on the growth and development. Fine. But by keeping in mind the FRBM and the different democratic setup we have, do you think it is possible nowadays to more rely on the public sector, that we are provoking that there is a lot of investment required from different types of sector? So how it should be possible?
No. See, this is about prioritization. There was a time.
Exactly. I am talking about you go through the.
No. There was a time. There was a time
demand
when Indian government went berserk on opening new industries. Government went for bread making. I don't know if you remember that. Government had modern bakery which used to make bread. Does government need to go for that? Bread is not even, Indian ordinary rural people don't even have bread even today. And government of India went for that. Do we need 5-star hotels to be running at a loss and government, losing money in that? Government, I'm not saying opening new factories everywhere. Government can go for some strategic sector like satellite, you might say, like aircraft, you might say, which are future. Maybe in collaboration with private sector, but government has to be there, because any sector which has very high risk, private sector will not come. Those are for there. I'm not saying government should go for any industry and spend. No, government doesn't need to invest on those sectors. But government has the responsibility to provide infrastructure, to provide health and education. So why I'm saying government sector is important, I'm not saying that government opens up a factory in every village. No, I'm not saying that. Even China is not doing that. China, many Chinese government factories have closed down. That is also one side of the story, where they thought that there is no need for the government to be in production of those goods. They have closed down those factories. So we can close down some of them. We can close down many government factories in India also. I have no issue with that. But saying that government will not even invest in education, health and infrastructure, everywhere you would need private, and government, I don't know what government will do. Government is not even doing policing job. And think about service sector growth that we are having. The housing complex I live has about 200 security guards. Tell me that 200 security guards salary is accounted as part of GDP as service sector. What is that part of GDP? That is coming from only my income. It's transfer income from me and other residents here. What productive they are doing? They're standing the whole day, right? This is because our law and order situation is so bad. The law and order situation is, if it improves, those people can be used for something productive. They don't have to keep standing whole day. So service sector growth, we had a talk about China. Let China take the lead in manufacturing. We'll take the lead in service sector growth. What happened to that? Where has the service sector gone? Service sector doesn't mean you have so many security guards. Service sector doesn't mean that, we're talking about, removing Chinese apps from Indian mobile. Why? Why China is not talking about Indian apps from their mobile? Because there is no Indian apps. What the hell we did? We claimed we are number one in service sector in IT. Why there is no single app that has global reputation from India? What happened to that? Why Chinese apps are everywhere in India and US and everybody is thinking about removing those apps? Remove them. I have no issue. I don't use TikTok anyway. But that was the point. Where is our industry doing? Where we promoted, we subsidize our IT sector. We built up IT park. We gave them huge tax concession. For what? And we are today saying we're removing Chinese apps. Why the Chinese app came at the first place? Why Indian apps was not much better than Chinese app that Indians would not even think about installing Chinese app their phone? So obviously something is wrong.
So whatever we are talking about, these are the
Nimai sir, Dr. Nimai, I will have to moderate here because we are running past our time and we've already exceeded the time, and there is also one more question from a student,
Okay.
I think. So
that I would encourage more students should be better.
yes, so if we could, Dr. Nimai, please.
Nimai can get to me one-to-one, he will have the opportunity, but not the students.
Yes. Anandjit, there was a student. Can you please ask him to, Satvik or somebody wanted to ask?
Yeah, this is Satvik.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Right. So first of all, I wanted to ask about, you just mentioned that we should follow the example of 19th century America right now, rather than 21st century. Right? Hello.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, by 19th century, don't take it literally, 19th century, they have slaves, right? So I'm not saying go for slaves.
Right, not go for
19th
slaves,
century, UK had colonies. I'm not saying go for colonies,
right,
but the kind of policies they followed, kind of economic policies they followed, that they keep on lying what they did and what they did. US economy had huge protection for its industries. Because their competitor was UK, they would have huge, import duty on garments coming from UK. This is history. They will not tell you, right?
Right.
So if you
Also, wasn't
the Chinese goods, it is fair. It's all right.
Right. Wasn't the 19th century also a time of like the most free market in America when companies like Standard Oil came into existence?
This is the lie they keep on telling you. Read the history properly. This is the lie they keep on telling you. This is the lie they can, as I gave the example, today China is not producing garments and shoes and those things, right? They sell you aircrafts, they sell you computers and those things. This is the example I give. Can any developing country think of making aircraft and selling in US markets by following free market? No. Without government support, no country will ever be able to do it. Right? So if you follow, the American advice, you produce agricultural goods, you only make ready-made garments. What Bangladesh is doing, Bangladesh will remain Bangladesh. They will never make aircraft. They will never make computers. So if you want to move up the value chain, if you want to, and by the way, by selling ready-made garments, you don't earn much of profit. Because something that everybody can do, you don't make much of profit. Something that only few people can do, you make huge profits. Now, this is the ideology that is being pushed for us. Government should not be there. Government should not help private sector. Private sector should stand on their own. Even now, this internet technology, where it originated, in the US, it originated the defense establishment. And they took advantage of the world. India also got advantage of internet. That's a different story. But this, coordination between private and government sector in terms of technology development, in terms of infrastructure creation, those have to be there. And, the way Chinese economy is managed, you call it subsidy or by any other name, that's a different thing. If you want to ensure level playing field, you have to put some duty. And now the problem is that you have MFN obligations. You cannot, impose duty on Chinese goods only. If you impose duty on Chinese goods, you have to impose duty on other goods from other countries also. Do that. But no country has developed on the basis of free trade, except there are exceptions, on free trade only, Singapore, Hong Kong. But Singapore is not a free economy. Go and buy an apartment in Singapore and tell me. Buy some land in Singapore and tell me. So Singapore is not a free market, by the way. But free trade, yes, they do it. But there's a very different story. I mean, Singapore and India is very different. So don't follow Singapore.
All right. And secondly, since most of us are at the start of our career and most of us wouldn't be going into politics directly, what are some practical, actionable steps we can take apart from buying local?
Okay, buying local is good, but be sure that you are buying local, because we are very good at passing on foreign-made goods as local. But I would say somebody said environment. So give preference to environment. Give preference to products, not just local, but give preference to products that, Gandhiji's Antodaya concept, that the poorest people can sell for you, produce for you, it's not you might not have seen Campa Cola. So I have seen it, but it's not about choice between Campa Cola and Coca-Cola. Let it be choice between Coca-Cola and Nimbu Pani and those bantas. So not just local, but also technology that your very local people can use. That will help a lot of people. That can also obviate some foreign, reduce some foreign competition. So that should be not just local. Local can be many things. Local can be exploitative also. So be careful about that.
So it's just an extension of.
But I'm not sure why you say you are not interested to go to politics. Very premature now. You are still a student.
Most of us
You don't know how
be
your life will change maybe in the next couple of years. And by all means, if you have good intention, go for politics. I'm not saying all politicians are bad, but we need more people in politics with good intentions.
Right. My point was that not most of us would be going into politics. And okay, so what you told was just an extension of our consumer behavior, right? Is there no other step that we can take apart from that?
Other step is that many of you the example I was giving, why there is no Indian app, So maybe among the Indians, risk-taking behavior is very different. So if you are not going for politics, you can think of going to business. No country can develop without domestic local business. We're talking about getting foreign companies. Even Chinese company, I was giving the example of out of 500 Fortune 500 companies, there are 115 Chinese companies. They're not foreign companies operating in China. They're Chinese companies. Now, if we think that, all those foreign companies will come to India and make our country develop, that's not going to happen. We need to be Atmanirbhar, and that means, you guys have to come, when I was a student, nobody encouraged me to go for business. Now it is too late for me, probably. So you can think about doing that. You can think of not seeking employment, but giving employment. This is one important message I can have for you if you are not going to politics.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for this.
Shantanu also wants to.
Shantanu, make it short. This is the last question we will take.
Yes, ma'am.
It should be a question.
Yes, ma'am. Hello.
Yeah.
Sir, good evening. I only have, it was supposed to be 3 questions, but I'll try to put it up and sum it up in one question.
Okay.
Sir, the only concern is will the Atmanirbhar itself be able to solve the forecasted 16% bank NPAs in 2021 according to the RBI? And what fiscal stimulus will boost the middle income spending? And should India think more like the frugal 4 of the European countries?
Well, see, NPS is a very different kind of problem. As I said, it has, developed over the years. And when industries go down, it also creates NPAs. And if we do not give some better breathing space to our domestic companies, NPAs will only go up. COVID will also lead to some NPAs. So there will be some difficulties involving NPA, and there is no easy solutions. And government has to kind of bail out, if not fully, but partly. That I cannot ignore. But stimulus, I think we have not yet given stimulus. Only loan is not stimulus. But stimulus is needed at very different level. I am not a very strong proponent of putting money in people's bank unless in a very crisis situation, unless you are talking about people who are physically unable to do any work. So that way I am a proponent of NREGA, but not really putting money for doing nothing. Unless it's a very crisis situation, as I was saying. So we need to ensure that how our people, poor people can live, and that will be one part of the stimulus where I think we have not done so well. We have to do that, it's not yet too late, we have to do that. Did I answer all your questions, or there is something I left?
Sir, just the last part was, should India think more like the frugal four of the European countries, sir?
See, this is a very, I'm not saying that you give your fiscal consideration total buy. You also need not be, fiscally excessively conservative. And
okay.
This fiscal conservatism can harm you actually. And these, the link between fiscal expansion and inflation is very tenuous. It's not well established. So I think we should not be too worried about that. But I'm not saying, give cautions, throw away the cautions. So we have to take something like some middle path,
So there shouldn't be a free hand while giving the fiscal stimulus, and one should also not be quite conservative. So we have to find the middle path, right, sir?
Exactly. That's why I'm saying, giving a lot of money to people for doing nothing, I'm not in favor of that. It creates huge, moral hazards problems. So that's not a good idea.
So, sir, just the last thing, do you think in the next, let's say, half a decade, India would be able to retain back its growth rate of, let's say, if not double digits, close to double digits in next half a decade?
Yeah, see, growth rate is somebody talked about GDP. So GDP and growth rate is a very flawed concept. There is no doubt about that. I give the example of service sector growth that is happening in India. And this problem is more in service sector. I give you an example, the law and order situation goes down, all of us employ security guards and we keep them standing, so they are not productive. People are earning for not doing anything productive. So it is not creating real value for the economy. This is service sector. The shopkeepers, take an example. The farmers selling a kg of potato at 2 rupees a kilo, and you buy at 40 rupees a kilo. So 30 rupees goes into the pocket of traders. This is service sector growth. But actually, farmers produce only 2 kg of potato. You consume only 2 kg of potato. That is the real addition to the whole in the economy. But service sector hugely inflated the growth and GDP. So I have serious concern about our actual GDP. Actually, it must be much lower if you actually do proper valuation. Service sector is a very misleading concept. You can't get real estimate of actually service sector contribution.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. So GDP growth is not a very good idea. Look, at end of the day, of course, you want people to be happy. Not GDP. when people are not having education, not good healthcare, not even getting food, GDP growth doesn't mean anything for many people.
Thank you, sir.
It's been a very, very interesting, comprehensive, and I must say, Professor Nityananda, it has been so hands-on. So you've simplified such complex things. For me, the takeaway is that small sentence that why should we have to uninstall TikTok? Why didn't China have to do something? Because we were lacking. And that kind of summarizes for me the entire what we really need to do. And I think for everybody, this is where we have to look at. We have to introspect and redefine. And I think this has been one of the most amazing sessions. And before I have to invite Professor Anandjeet for the formal vote of thanks. But Professor Nityananda, it has been a wonderful, wonderful.
Thank you, it's a
Thank
pleasure.
you so
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chaviji. And thank you, Nituda, my mentor, the person who scolded me the most during the working years. And I have learned extensively about this 360-degree learning about truth. So he will tell me, question the truth, don't go by a theory. And that has helped me always. So I will do the more mundane part, Nituda, not the Atmanirbhar part of it. So the mundane part is that on behalf of Vice President O.P. Bhalla Foundation, I would like to thank the following people. We will like to thank Chancellor Dr. Prashant Bhalla, MRIIRS, President Dr. Amit Bhalla, MRIIRS, then Honorable DG, MREI, O.P. Bhalla Foundation, Honorable VC, MRIIRS, Pro VC, Dean Academics, Registrar, MRIIRS, all the HODs. I'm so glad that it was a fantastic discussion. Thank you, Nimaida, for asking those questions. Tripathi ji, HOD Psychology. My beloved colleague, Jen Sundaresan ji, who has been constantly helping. Other colleagues, Pratichi, Priya, who are also coming up and putting up all their hard work to create a discussion. I see Adi over there coming suddenly for some time. Okay. And also every faculty member of FBSS from the Department of Economics, Psychology, Department of Social and Political Studies, all students and participants for such patient listening. Chief, thanks a lot to set the debate rolling and to start the first question and consecutively all the other further questions. And finally, the people who makes us Atmanirbhar Nituda for this program, that we can do it with Zoom, and the people are Umesh Datta, Pooja Gerotra, Sabyasachi Sen, and Shipra, who works day in and day out with Chaviji. If I've missed any name, please pardon me. It's completely inadvertent. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
You missed your name.
Thank
You
you.
missed your name.
No, I don't.
Anandjeet, thank you.
No, I don't need to take my name. Okay. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for this active discussion. Thank you. That's the culture we want to.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, Nitula. Thank you.